Have you ever read something that is just absolutely horrifying? Like, absolutely horrifying. Terrible in all respects. From space monsters to terrifying colors from outer space to gods and sea demons, even zombies. There's some crazy stuff in this book. HP Lovecraft, Tales of Horror. That's coming right up here on Drew's Book Reviews. Stay tuned. Good day, good day, good day. Welcome to another episode of Drew's Book Reviews. Today we are reviewing my HP Lovecraft Tales of Horror Collected Works books, which I happened to finish up last month, much earlier than anticipated, but I'm glad that I did. So we're going to talk about that today. And also, of course, make sure you check out all the links down in the description below. You'll see links to my Bookstagram, Discord, all that good stuff. And don't forget to hit that like button. Comment at the end of this video, tell me what you thought, and if you like seeing this bookish content, make sure you hit that subscribe button. So let's talk a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft, Tales of Horror. Now, H.P. Lovecraft, he basically is the foundation of horror from what I've heard. Some people might disagree with that, and that is okay, but he is well known for his horror stories and the classics like Call of Cthulhu and At the Mountains of Madness, and all kinds of really amazing stories that he's written. Not appreciated in his time, much like Edgar Allan Poe. H.P. Lovecraft was not appreciated in his time, and his works have become part of that pop culture horror type landscape that we see today, with so much being influenced by H.P. Lovecraft, especially with things like Cthulhu and the Mythos and the ancient or the old ones that is regularly referenced throughout H.P. Lovecraft's works. Now, before I picked up this book, I'd only heard about things relating to H.P. Lovecraft. I'd heard about some of the mythos like Cthulhu. I'd heard about At the Mountains of Madness and The Color Out of Space and the Dunwich Horror and all kinds of things like that. The Cats of Uthar. I'd heard about many of these things, but I never actually got the opportunity to actually read these stories that all this stuff is generated from until I read H.P. Lovecraft's collected works. Now, I absolutely love this edition. This is from the Canterbury Press, and like H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe, they're both from the same. It's very much like the Edgar Allan Poe book. Now, what's really interesting that I found is that H.P. Lovecraft seemed to have been inspired by Edgar Allan Poe in many of his stories. Just as an example of that, I believe it was in The Mountains of Madness that he made a reference to the narrative of Gordon A. Pym, which is a story by Edgar Allan Poe that describes the narrative of explorers exploring the Antarctic. And in At the Mountains of Madness story, there is reference to Edgar Allan Poe's works of the narrative of Gordon A. Pym, and that's just one of a few references to Poe that actually popped up in his stories. And I never knew that before reading H.P. Lovecraft, that he seems to have been a fan of or regularly referencing Edgar Allan Poe and inspired by much of what Edgar Allan Poe wrote, which is actually a pretty cool thing, because last year I actually read Edgar Allan Poe, those collected works, and then this year I've read H.P. Lovecraft's Tales of Horror. I just thought that was a really cool thing, where learning that Lovecraft was actually, may very well have been, inspired by much of Edgar Allan Poe's writing. So that was a really cool thing to experience, and having those references, and after, of course, reading Poe, and then seeing the references in some of the stories here by H.P. Lovecraft, it's like, hey, wait a minute, I know that story, I read that story, I recognize what that reference is too. Not every reference is blatantly out in the open, they're just subtle things that could be here and there that reference Edgar Allan Poe's writing. So that is something that I really enjoyed about this book. Some of my favorite stories by H.P. Lovecraft within this book is the one that actually opens with Dagon. So this is about a sea god or a sea monster that our characters have to deal with, and it really is just this massive sea monster. And the temple, which is another story by H.P. Lovecraft, kind of references back to this Dagon myth, where the temple seems to be this underwater, ancient, buried city in the ocean, and the temple of this god Dagon. So one thing that's really interesting about Lovecraft's works is much of them are interwoven and linked and connected, and while each story can be read as a standalone story, much of the stories that H.P. Lovecraft wrote all kind of tie back to that greater mythos. Cthulhu, of course, being one of them, the Call of Cthulhu, which I am convinced is linked to Dagon, and the Call of Cthulhu being another classic reference or classic HP Lovecraft tale. Cthulhu being this bat-winged octopus cephalopod-like ocean god, which we've all seen the image of Cthulhu. Like, when you see Cthulhu, you know who Cthulhu is, and it's just this terrifying, monstrous, demonic god that is part of that. And one of the interesting stories that I also enjoyed from this book is The Color Out of Space. Now, when I first heard this, I knew it was kind of this terror, this horror, of course, because of course it is HP Lovecraft. Of course it's going to have that horror element to it. But The Color Out of Space was a really interesting one for me as well, because essentially what it boils down to is The Color Out of Space is not something that is taking place in space, but rather it's like, my impression of it anyways, this radioactive meteorite crashes into the earth, and then this odd color deformation starts forming from the crops and the animals that are in the area that are affected by this radioactive meteorite that crashes to the earth. And this is what kind of causes that horror, that terror, and the sickness and dread that comes upon that. So that's kind of where The Color Out of Space comes from, and I really kind of like that, because everything as far as what this meteorite has done, it's reference to is this color, because everything seems to turn this particular color, and it came from space, hence The Color Out of Space. And I really kind of like that about that, because I was expecting something different. I was expecting maybe some kind of demonic, spiritual, non-corporeal entity of a certain color with coming in from space and terrorizing the people. That's what I imagined when I first heard The Color Out of Space as far as the title goes. But it completely turned out to be something very different than what I expected. And it's always a good thing when you're surprised by something, when something turns out different than you expected. That is always a good thing. And I love that about The Color Out of Space. It was not what I expected, and still a really good story. Now, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadava, that was an interesting one. This is definitely reads like somebody going on some kind of crazy hallucinogenic trip through all kinds of weird and messed up stuff. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadava is one that I think I'll always remember with some of the imagery that's within that story. So The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadava is Randall Carter's quest through these dreamlands, where we got these strange glowing phosphorescent funguses and twisted corridors and the old ones and the souls of who knows what. And just in general, it is a very fascinating quest through Dreamland for Randall Carter. Randall Carter is actually one of the main characters throughout HP Lovecraft's work, and he shows up in several of his different stories throughout the book. Some of the creatures within this Dream Quest of Unknown Kadava are called the Zogs or Zogs, or I don't know, it's Zoogs or Zogs, one of the two. I suppose both pronunciations work, but it's really kind of this twisted, dream, trippy type of environment and type of story, and it just really is an interesting read, and I highly recommend checking that out, especially if you are a HP Lovecraft fan and you love kind of into that mythos of the old ones and spirits and all kinds of crazy stuff. With regard to the horror elements that HP Lovecraft has within his works. One thing that I did find with HP Lovecraft's writing is it definitely has a style that is not very heavy dialogue focused, but rather very much narrative driven and very much descriptive in its essence. Much of the way HP Lovecraft writes in his works is to really kind of leave descripting details very vague. In many cases throughout many of his stories, what we kind of see and hear and find within his stories is often he will write as the narrator saying, I dare not describe what I've seen or experienced in too much detail because of the terror and the horror that it will inflict upon you. And that's kind of the essence of a lot of the way that he's written within his book. So he definitely does want to leave a lot to the imagination of the individual reader, but at the same time building up that suspense and horror and that feeling of just utter terror that the character that we're following along in these stories is feeling. And that is definitely a unique approach. Gotta be honest, I thought it left a little too vague at some points, that it was really hard for me to envision or understand what the character was going through at that point. But overall, I do think that H.P. Lovecraft, with his kind of vague characterization, his vague descriptions in some cases, or just simply leaving out what is happening, saying, hey, I can't describe this to you, it's too terrifying, kind of thing, did kind of, make you think, oh my gosh, what could be so horrible that, our narrator doesn't even want to tell us what they're seeing. And that was kind of a fun way to go about it as well within these writings. We see some of that effect in the story at the Mountains of Madness, which is basically set in Antarctica, and they discover these ancient ruins of this absolutely ancient civilization. And the ancient old ones that seem to have this abandoned city. And at the Mountains of Madness, there are several points where characters are trying to get through this ancient city, in which HP Lovecraft does mention that the sight that we beheld was just too terrible and too horrible to describe. So he definitely does put that in there. Now, it is certainly a writing style that would take some getting used to, I think, for some readers who prefer kind of more of that balance mix between dialogue and descriptiveness. I mean, if you like the description and heavy detail, this is HP Lovecraft is definitely a good writer for that, for sure. But definitely, it's very different than what we see in modern works and more modern fantasy, science fiction, and horror stories that we have. And overall, I would have to say that I really enjoyed my read-through of HP Lovecraft this year. I enjoyed reading this book so much, and it just really was an enjoyable read. And I would definitely recommend it. If you're an HP Lovecraft fan, I would say this is a must-get edition. I absolutely love the Canterbury Press edition of HP Lovecraft's collected works. It's absolutely wonderful. The Canterbury Classics books are probably some of my favorite books that I've got on my shelf. HP Lovecraft, I really enjoyed it. Tales of Horror. Now I'm much more familiar with HP Lovecraft, and I'm glad that I read it. So this was just a great read overall. I really enjoyed it, and I hope that you would enjoy it too, especially if you like that horror element and you like that classic horror. I haven't read much in the way of modern horror, but hey, maybe I will pick it up at some point. Who knows? Horror's never really been my thing, but the mystery, the suspense, the fantastical elements, and the deep cosmic horror that is HP Lovecraft. For whatever reason, I just love that about this. And the cosmic horror, the old ones, the ancient ones, Cthulhu and Mountains of Madness and Dunwich horror and all kinds of stuff like that. Just an enjoyable read, and I would say check it out if you haven't, especially if you like horror. This was a really good read, and I really, really enjoyed it. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this review video, and I hope that you like, comment, and subscribe, and of course check out all the links down below. And as always, thank you for watching, and until next time, keep on reading. Bye!